Servus Männer, it's Red Pill Germany again. Today I want to tell you about the popularity ranking of Angela Merkel and her government. Since the current health crisis has spread from the Far East also to Europe, we have seen a lot of countermeasures being implemented, and the liberties and personal freedom of the German people have been limited by our government in a noticeable way. And there are some new polls now that I want to talk about. According to these new polls, the ruling coalition, but especially Angela Merkel's party and especially Angela Merkel's personal popularity values are on a really high level. This is a tendency that is not unique to Germans, but it is a very pronounced tendency of ours, and that is in times of crisis, we stand behind our leadership. We circle the wagons around a government that doesn't want to close the gates and that doesn't want to man the city walls. So in this video I want to go over these polls in a little more detail and explain that to you so that you know what is going on in Germany at the moment. Of course, it is up to you if you want to trust these numbers or if you think that they're all propaganda. And then towards the end, of course, I will interpret that a bit, how I see that from my perspective and what could be possible explanations for that. But before I start, I want to thank all my subscribers and my supporters. If you like my material, like, share and subscribe, because we all know that the algorithms are not working to the advantage of people like me. If you find this information valuable or entertaining, consider making a donation via PayPal or supporting me via Patreon or Subscribestar. Alright, so in several recent videos I already reported about the measures that are being taken in Germany, how our public and personal lives have been affected, how many businesses are suffering now from the restrictions that were placed on them by our federal and local governments. So what are the Germans thinking about all that according to the polls? So here we have a survey that was conducted at the beginning of this month, at the beginning of April, and the first question was, are you satisfied with the work of our federal government? And you see that this distribution peaks in the middle. Not many people are extremely satisfied and not many people, only 11%, that is in percent, yes, are not at all satisfied, but more people are satisfied than rather not satisfied. So Germans seem to be still rather satisfied with the work of our government. And you also see in the second column of numbers here, you see the change of the percentages with respect to March. So here you see a massive shift of these answers from the lower lines, so the not so satisfied answers, towards the satisfied answers. That is actually huge. That is massive. That's almost a 30% change from not satisfied to rather satisfied. So that is a rather general question, but the next question now targets the measures that were taken as a response to the current health crisis specifically. So in this question, the Germans were asked about their opinion towards the current contact bans, and a whopping 93% of the people that were asked apparently support the contact bans. That means you cannot visit anybody who is not living in your house or apartment anyway. And there has only been a very slight change in this tendency compared to March. So here in another very general question, the people were asked if they are rather optimistic or if they are rather worried about the future in Germany. So the answers are rather split here. A little more people answered that they are worried, but compared to the question in March, 9% more of the people are optimistic in April. So what are people worried about? This is a very symmetrical outcome. When people were asked if they are worried about contracting the China bug, the people answered like this. A wonderful bell curve shaped distribution. When people were asked about the economic situation in Germany, then 75% of the people said that they think the future will be worse in Germany, but only 34% think that they themselves have economic troubles in the future. So they don't worry about themselves so much, they worry about the economic future of our country. And that is a very plausible outcome. If somebody asked me to guess what the percentages might have been, I would have guessed an outcome such as this actually. Maybe in the current discussion it is also important to say that a majority of the Germans still trusts in doctors and medical institutions. Another controversial point that I have covered in one of my videos before is the question of, would you use a smartphone app in order to allow the authorities to track who you have been in contact with in case somebody got tested positive and they need to retrace the steps and the different contact persons of that positive person. And here the population is once again split. 47% said in April that they would use such an app, and 45% declared that they would not use such an app. When asked for the reason why they would refuse to use such an app, most people said that they are concerned about data security, privacy issues, and increasing government surveillance. 14% also said that it is not necessary and the benefit is not obvious to them, but most of the people are actually concerned about privacy issues here. That is definitely the dominant reason for why people would refuse to use or install such an app. A more general but definitely related question was whether or not people are worried that their freedoms and their liberties would be limited also for a longer amount of time or actually permanently. This is something I always warned about. Temporary measures, yes, but no long-term measures or restrictions. And here I have to say that while it is rather split, a clear majority of the Germans is not worried. 38% of the participants are not worried a lot and 19% are almost not worried at all about this question. It is very interesting, I think, that the people who made this survey had a little closer look at the people who responded in this question, and they also looked at the party preference of those people. Generally, the outcome here is not surprising to me. Here you can see that the voters or the supporters of the AfD worry the most about loss of civil rights and liberties. Whereas the Green Party and the Social Democrats don't worry at all about that, of course. They are, after all, the parties of bans and restrictions, of government control and of higher taxes. Now, the Union parties, CDU-CSU, are of course the parties of the surveillance state, and this outcome also doesn't surprise me. For most people, the answer that the supporters of the FDP, our pretend liberal party, and the party Die Linke, our commie party, gave is probably the most surprising here. To me, only the answer of the supporters of the commie party was a surprise actually. I would have guessed that the FDP supporters are not really worried about the restrictions of freedoms and our civil rights because they are not a liberal party, they are a rich people's elitist party, and they know that their class will of course have ways to go around these restrictions. They know full well that these restrictions will only hit the majority of the people, but not the 1%. Or in other words, the globalist elites have nothing to fear. Bear in mind, however, that the AfD is the only party whose supporters in a majority care about the loss of civil rights and freedoms in Germany. So that stands in a stark contrast to government propaganda about this party and their electorate. And should this entire survey be fake, you would have to assume that the census made a little mistake here or overlooked this question. So these were the results of some of the attitudes of the German people when it comes to these recent questions. But how does that translate into votes or polls for certain party preferences? So let's look first at the most popular politicians of Germany. So we have already seen that the government is profiting from the current crisis. So that means we would also expect that the government politicians, the leading coalitions politicians, that is CDU, CSU and SPD, would also profit from the current shift in opinions. And here you can see that mostly the politicians of the CDU and the CSU could profit from that in their personal popularity rating. Only Mr. Scholz, our vice chancellor, could profit from that in a meaningful way. Politicians of opposition parties are not really affected that strongly from the current events, and they are overall not that popular anyway. So Angela Merkel, once again, the most popular politician in Germany, and then there is Mr. Scholz, and then the next four ones are also from the CDU or from the CSU, like Mr. Söder and Mr. Seehofer. The CSU is the Bavarian sister party of the CDU, of Angela Merkel. So maybe the most important question is the so-called Sonntagsfrage, the Sunday question. That is how we call the question when we ask people, who would you vote for? What party would you vote for if next Sunday, coming Sunday, would be a federal election? And here we can see that in the recent most polls from the middle of April, we can see that the union parties, CDU, CSU, under the leadership of Angela Merkel, have roughly as many votes as the leftist parties, Die Linke, the SPD and the Green Party taken together. The SPD cannot profit in a significant way as a government coalition party at the moment from the current crisis. Only Angela Merkel's union parties can do that. The AfD is also losing some of their votes in the polls, and they are now at around 10%. Here you can see the differences of the current polling results to the last elections in the fall of 2017. You see that all parties but the Green Party and the Union parties lost. The Green Party is still scoring higher than in the last federal elections. However, if you look at the following trend, this is a time series of this Sunday question. You can really see what happened in the context of the Green Party. Look at that. This is a very important graph, and this is why I also choose it as the background of my nice thumbnail. You see that in the spring of 2019, the Green Party had almost 20%. And then the Greta effect happened, and when it was nice and warm outside, the students thought that they don't have to go to school anymore on Fridays. And the Green Party mysteriously jumped from below 20 to over 25%. When it got a little colder outside, this effect was shrinking, however. And you see that with the onset of the current crisis, they dropped actually below the value they still had in April 2019, a year ago. They are approaching the 15% margin once again. You can also see nicely here that other opposition parties also lost, and the SPD could just improve a tiny little bit since February 2020. The only party that is soaring high here is clearly the CDU-CSU under the leadership of Markus Söder and Angela Merkel, represented by the black line here, of course. So Angela Merkel is perceived, as always, as somebody who doesn't make any harsh decisions, who is not using any crass languages, and she's perceived as someone who thinks carefully before she makes a decision. Mr. Söder in Bavaria, where the electorate is more conservative, has positioned himself as Mr. Law and Order, and also because Bavaria is one of the most heavily affected federal states in this current crisis, he was always the one who demanded the most harsh restrictions right away. So he plays this role rather well apparently, and most people agree with that, or at least he sees an improvement in his and his party's popularity. Among the regional princes of Germany, he stands here in stark opposition to Mr. Laschet, who is more on Angela Merkel's side and who was strictly opposed to border checks, for example, as he comes from North Rhine-Westphalia. Yes, I think I pronounced that correctly. So according to what I have heard from other countries, Germany is somewhere in the middle. We have restrictions, we have taken measures, but not as severely and not as strictly as in many other European countries. This middle path apparently is, for the moment at least, still satisfying to many Germans and to the German electorate, according to polls. Of course, we know that many polls have been wrong in the past, but especially in Germany, polls about elections have never been that far off the mark in recent years. And even though it is hard to imagine for some people, but when you live in Germany and when you have a lot of contact with so-called normies or people who are not getting their information from abroad or also from some alternative sources in addition to the mainstream, these outcomes are actually quite believable and plausible. So the media is now even speculating about something that Merkel has always categorically denied until now, and that is if Angela Merkel wants even another term in 2 years. Maybe you know that among the CDU-CSU there is a debate now and there is a struggle for who is going to be the frontrunner, the chancellor candidate in the next federal election of our Bundestag, our federal parliament. Will it be Mr. Laschet? Will it be Mr. Söder? Will it be Mr. Merz or someone completely different? But now, when you look at these popularity values of Angela Merkel, wouldn't it make sense that Angela Merkel will just do it for another term? Yeah, no kidding. That is actually what they are asking right now. So I don't know if Angela Merkel is actually annoyed by this or if she paid them to write that. I have no idea. But I think it is time for her retirement, rather sooner than later. Alright, let me know what you think about that in the comments down below, and I'm especially interested in how your country or your people are reacting in times of crisis. It doesn't have to be this current one, but generally. In such a situation, are you circling the wagons or are you holding your leader's feet to the fire? Let me know down below, and as always, be safe wherever you are. Servus, Kameraden.